So I'd love to talk about the graph you sent in chat.
All right.
All right, so we got a graph
Let me get
here.
to the graph.
All right.
So look at this graph. So we have a little
Don't hurt yourself.
a little compass here. We
I'm
got.
gonna hurt you if you ain't careful.
Oh no.
Promise?
Oh no.
The past couple of weeks on From the Machine, we have been engaging in some pretty serious genre discourse. We just wrapped up our series on horror in film, in literature, in music, and now we're on sci-fi, fantasy, spec fic. There's two traps you can fall into with genre analysis. One is rejecting it outright, saying that genre is a arbitrary codification and you should let it speak for itself. But let's be real, we judge art based on preconceptions. Every time you experience art, we can think about music or film, you are comparing this to your past experiences, and genre is just something that comes out of this. But the other trap you can fall into is the prescriptive trap, because genre is descriptive. We're trying to say things about these pieces of art that do exist for themselves. I watch a lot of videos about writing novels, but there's a lot of, if you want to write a fantasy book, you need to do these things. If you're writing something else, then you don't need to worry about this. But if it's fantasy, you need to do this. And I'm kind of skeptical of that kind of approach to this. So I try to think of genre more of a way of describing a trend in culture, a kind of experience. Like you go for, like we just talked about, you go for speculative fiction in general because it helps you get to some sort of truth about humans beyond our immediate circumstances. Regular fiction, novels, that's speaking to a specific time, a specific place. It's very contingent, but speculative fiction, the appeal is it gets beyond contingencies. Let's introduce an entirely new set of contingencies and what stays true about how people act, how people feel.
But what do you believe will remain true? For, like, how will people change in regards to this new stimuli?
Exactly. So when we talk about science fiction versus fantasy and make a graph like we're about to talk about, why would you do that to start with?
I think one really easy thing is if you want to read a book about spaceships and alien planets and laser guns, you know sci-fi might have those compared to fantasy. Fantasy is like swords and dragons and magic. You have these two different worlds. You can write them similarly. You can have similar narrative or aesthetic touches to it, but if someone's looking for, man, I really just need a book with a bunch of gears and steam power and like Victorian era, well, steampunk is your genre. If you want, late rainy nights and neon signs and, a critique on capitalism, go to cyberpunk. When you use your past experiences to look for something that you want, you know what to expect within certain genres, certain ideas or imagery.
At least a general theme of like science fiction is looking to the future. It's saying, okay, we have this culture now, we have this circumstances now. If this continues to evolve, what might happen? Versus fantasy and to some extent alternate history is looking to the past. What if none of this ever happened? What if there is no capitalism to even think about? Mm-hmm. We're still in a feudal system, and we're kept in a feudal system by the fact that dragons exist. Mm-hmm. What then?
So I have to pay extra taxes to my king because he protects me from dragons, hopefully.
Well, I think it comes down to the names of each of the genres at that point. We associate science with technology pretty directly. So when you hear science fiction, you think, okay, so we're creating a fiction based on this technology. And that's not always necessarily the case, but it's based on, like Connor was saying, taking what we have now and kind of progressing it. And with fantasy, it's not based on our reality. You are changing the rules of reality rather than taking the rules we have that we deal with on a day-to-day basis and taking that to its natural conclusion.
And this also explains a lot of edge cases, like Star Wars, aesthetically sci-fi, thematically fantasy, set in another universe.
A long time ago.
Yeah, in a galaxy far away. Or Dune, set 20,000 years in the future, where there's no memory of this world, except for like Genghis Khan and Hitler. But also, I think of like some weird fiction stuff by William Hope Hodgson or Clark Ashton Smith that's set in the distant future similarly, but is more fantasy, like
narratively or aesthetically?
all of it. The Nightlands by William Hope Hodgson, it's set in the distant future, but it's strictly fantasy. Everyone lives in a big pyramid, and there's spirits and evil entities. And I forget the name, but Clark Ashton Smith wrote a bunch of stories set in the last continent on Earth. It's sword and sorcery. Straight up. It's like a Conan the Barbarian kind of thing.
Almost like kind of pulpy, almost.
Yeah.
One meshing of genre that I really like is when they find a way to do science fantasy, and they have different ways they do this. You could classify Star Wars as science fantasy. It's a sci-fi world with a fantasy narrative. But one thing I like to see is like post-apocalyptic world that's been like so far destroyed and forgotten that a new fantasy civilization arises from the ashes. I don't remember what story this was, but there's like a group of people that are traveling across like a wetlands, and you see like the Oregon Space Needle like half sunken in the earth, and like no one knows what that is. It's a statue of you know times long past, but that's still Earth hundreds of years in the future, and you have these people that don't know anything about what modern day our society was like, living on our planet hundreds of years later. I love when they do stuff like that.
Yeah. This might say something about just like a cyclical understanding of time, where you get this far future that looks like the far past. Supposing any sort of catastrophe falls, whether it be apocalypse, whether it be the Butlerian Jihad, whatever technologies around us, whatever circumstances are around us, there are some universals.
Shout out to Planet of the Apes.
That was one. I think this Planet of like the original 1960s cut with what's his name? Who was the lead? I forget his name, but I watched that movie with my dad when I was a kid, and I fell in love with it. I think that really sparked an interest in science fiction and spec evolution. What happens when you go back to your planet and you don't know you're on your planet, and there's apes riding horses with guns? Mm-hmm. How wild is that?
Only to find out. If y'all haven't seen the twist at this point, you're like 60 years too late. I'm going to spoil Planet of the Apes. It's just Earth.
Also, Darth Vader is Luke's father, and Rosebud is the sled.
Oh, no.
The y-axis is aesthetics. Upward on the y-axis is science fiction. Downward on the y-axis is fantasy. Also, all this exposition is unnecessary. I'll be popping this up on the screen for the YouTube videos. And anyone listening on Spotify, fuck you. Spotify sucks.
See, this is why you should Apple Music.
The x-axis is narrative. To the left is narratively fantasy. To the right is narratively science fiction. So we've got 4 quadrants. There are works that are aesthetically science fiction and narratively science fiction. This is the quintessential sci-fi. Your Star Treks, your Isaac Asimovs.
I'd throw Blade Runner in there.
Blade Runner, yeah. Philip K. Dick, his works or adaptations of his works. Then there is works that are aesthetically science fiction, but narratively fantasy. This is home to works like Star Wars, which it's got spaceships, it's got faster than light travel.
Laser guns, aliens.
Pew, pew. It's also got magic and magic classes.
Space wizards, etc.
And no one cares how faster than light travel actually works until you get into the weeds of the expanded universe.
Well, hey, I made the Kessel run in 12 parsecs.
Now, Dune is arguable.
It's soft sci-fi compared to like hard science fiction.
Yeah, it's also tricky because a lot of the, we would call it a one big lie science fiction work, where the only element that's not actually scientific is the spice.
Yeah.
You can compare it to like Mass Effect, which is very hard sci-fi, except the Mass Effect element 0 is like straight up magic. Dune, similarly, everything, even the Bene Gesserit voice, in the movies, it's portrayed as like a supernatural. You say something, it forces people to do things. In the books, it's described as more just like they've had 20,000 years of human evolution to focus on how do you say a thing in a certain tone that's really, really convincing. You can imagine if we didn't have computers to think about, and just focused on the technology of humanity, how much would we be able to think about the science of rhetoric, convincing people to do things with your tone? All that just to say, yeah, the spice is like magic.
It's magic oil.
Yeah,
Yep.
pretty much.
Magic oil. You can see the future, which means you don't need hyperspace lanes and charts. The Spacing Guild just snorts a line of spice, and they can see the path through stars and get you from point A to point B.
Have you heard about the discussion about how Star Wars kind of ripped off Dune?
It's pretty obvious. I mean, a lot of things ripped off Dune.
The voice is none of your Jedi mind tricks, but
Yeah.
I'm going to use my voice on you to make you go do something.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Frank
Desert
Herbert-
planet.
A desert planet. The main character has to go to the desert planet.
The sandworms, even though it's not in the movies necessarily, but
There was the
Sarlacc
the
pit.
Mandal-
the
Sarlacc-
Sarlacc pit, I guess, yeah.
or the like the Dune dragon, sand dragon from the
yeah.
Mandalorian series. Mm-hmm. But another thing, Frank Herbert, like when he saw the Star Wars movies or he heard about them, he was so angry at George Lucas for what he thought was ripping him off. So he took C-3PO and kind of plagiarized that into like one of his Dune novels as someone that passes off this fake wood, or as a cheap remake of something that already exists, which is like what he believes Star Wars did for Dune.
Diss track.
Writers dropping diss tracks on each other.
So to finish off the chart, we've got the y-axis is aesthetics, the x-axis is narrative. In the aesthetically fantasy side of things, we've got both aesthetically and narratively fantasy would be your Lord of the Ringses, your
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones.
You could probably say Harry Potter.
Yeah, anything that's, fantasy, period, that would be both aesthetically and narratively fantasy. And then you've got things that are aesthetically fantasy, but narratively science fiction. This chart online mentions Discworld, which I sadly have not read any Discworld material, but from what I know about it, I feel like that's accurate.
There is, you guys know who Coheed Cambria is, that band. You know, a lot of the music is inspired by the lead singer's comic book series,
Yeah,
The Amory Wars.
I've heard that. I've not read the series, though.
I think it would fall into narrative sci-fi, aesthetic fantasy, because there are spaceships and other planets, but there's this magical energy that binds all these planets together, and a federation has come out of that. And there's a race of people called mages that have magical abilities, and they try to like take over the world, or the keywork as it's called in the Amory Wars. And the main character is the son of like two cyborg robots they're just human, but they were like put together like through science. And he's this messianic figure called the Crowing, who has magical abilities. But it's all this fantasy stuff in a sci-fi setting.
Okay.
I highly recommend it.
So, if we are talking about different movies that fall under this chart, are y'all familiar with the movie Robots?
The animated.
God. Yeah.
There's a world going on underground.
Tom
knew
Waits
it
was
was going
sitting in
that-
with us.
Yeah.
So, aesthetically science fiction, narratively fantasy.
Robots being
I
narratively
feel like
fantasy.
it's a lot more fantasy than it is science fiction,
It
because
is
while
kinda
it's based
basically
around
the- yeah.
robots, it's a fantasy setting.
Well, and this is a hero's journey, which I feel is more of a fantasy thing than a sci-fi thing.
I mean, the point of the hero's journey is it's universal.
Well, yeah, but
My question for the fantasy of robots is, I think for something to be narratively fantasy, it needs to be divorced from real world concerns. I think it needs to gravitate on broad ideals of good versus evil. Star Wars does, Lord of the Rings, because to me, fantasy, it's pretty much in the name. It is trying to abstract from the nuances of life and flatten things over, whereas robots feels like an actual social critique to me.
It is, in a sense, a social critique, but it is also removed in that you don't deal with what's necessitated in everyday human life. You don't have to worry about job. You don't have to worry about bills. You don't have to worry about food. It's fundamentally a story of a hero who only wants to do good going up against a truly evil force that's literal purpose is to melt you down.
But they do have to have jobs.
Yeah, and the reason they're melting
Yeah.
robots is consumerism. It's to make shiny new metal armor, right?
Yeah, there's money systems in it. There's all that good fun.
They do have to worry about their day-to-day to an extent, like, because the father is getting older. He's not a great dishwasher like he used to be.
There's class structures, all that, everything.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah.
The idea of someone going out on an adventure to try to better themselves and, the people back home, I think that's also just a very universal idea in general.
It is. It is.
And you would see that in a lot of fantasy. I mean, Frodo has to leave the Shire and he becomes the ring bearer. He's carrying the burden of getting rid of it, but he does want to go home and have potatoes and, drink and be with friends and family. He wants to protect them, and he's the suffering servant, if you will.
Which is kind of wild that he goes to elf heaven or whatever the hell it was
the Grey
called.
Isles or something. Yeah.
Afterwards, he's like, okay, I just did all this for these people. I'm not the same. I can't exist in a world that I just did all that.
I just went through World War I. I'm a peace out.
Yeah. I mean, that is the reason that they said he's one of the few people allowed to go there that's not an elf, because they're like, he has lived enough of an experience that he'll understand what the purpose of this place is. Like, it's to get away from the world. And yeah, they felt that was a good thank you to let him live his life in a place isolated because of, the amount of trauma he went through. He wouldn't be able to just go back to the Shire.
Yeah.
But tying back to robots, Aunt Fanny.
We're going to be his robot grind. I was going to try to work out where on the scale Warhammer would go. I feel that might go directly in the center.
Yeah.
If there was a third layer just for like how dark it was, it would be like bottom axis, Z-axis.
Well, because like there's all the things in this. There's like technical evolution. There's
Spaceships and sci-fi, but there's also monsters.
Literal magic and monsters and orcs.
And there's the gods.
Yeah.
Slanesh and
Chaos
Nurgle and all them.
beings.
This gets into especially the origins of these definitions of sci-fi fantasy, and I'm going to throw in horror here because in the start it was kind of a melting pot. A lot of sci-fi tropes came out of the same pulp scene that birthed H.P. Lovecraft. I mean, sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Sufficiently advanced alien evolution is indistinguishable from gods. Like this blending between the idea of an eldritch god that hates humanity and an alien that's just bent on universal takeover.
Well, and I like the concept of the Eldritch gods aren't as scary because of how advanced technology is in that universe. It's like, okay, we could kill a god, sorta. It's like feasible to do it.
Might be difficult, but we have the means of doing it.
Yeah.
If you build your army right.
I still want to play Warhammer.
So where I found this screenshot, again, I found it somewhere online, but I'm tracing it back to a Reddit thread. I cropped the graph because in the original, there's a second one that has Doctor Who encircling the entire graph. A few people in the comments mentioned also Warhammer circling the entire thing.
I could see that. Yeah, I was wondering about Doctor Who, mostly because I looked over and saw the Doctor Who book on the shelf.
So I will fully admit I've never really watched Doctor Who. I've seen a collective of like maybe 3.5 episodes.
Damn.
The show's not for me, but I understand that it's had a big influence.
You don't like British people.
Which 3.5 episodes? Because also keep in mind, there's a lot of different writers on Doctor Who. Some of them are incredible, mind-blowing. Some of them are getting a paycheck.
Yeah. No, there's some really fun ones and like traumatizing ones, especially if you're in like the 10th Doctor, David Tennant's stuff. Still, David Tennant and Christopher Eccleston, my two favorite.
Yeah. What was the name of the producer on those?
Stephen Moffat? No.
Richard T. Davies? Is that it?
Something like that. But yeah. Stephen Moffat was the writer for a lot of the best episodes. And then he became the showrunner at the 11th Doctor. And that's when like his narrative started to not be as appealing to me. Because he was really good at like single, like one-off, really good things. But when he tried to make the entire season, it just got convoluted and not in the fun, convoluted way.
Well, Stephen Moffat's strength was specifically sci-fi horror. And again, we can tie this in with the origins of weird fiction and science fiction as we know it in the same place. H.P. Lovecraft is a science fiction writer. He just happens to write scary science fiction that involves aliens that have no care for humanity and might casually obliterate it if they feel like it.
Would you say Frankenstein is more sci-fi or more horror? Or do you think it's a good mix of both?
It was written before there was a distinction between the two.
Okay.
A lot of science fiction, especially back in the day when we were actually speculating about what science might have to offer humanity, a lot of it was pretty scary. You brought up, I have no mouth and I must scream. That is one of the most horrific science fiction stories ever written, but it's not horrific because it's specifically trying to write a scary scenario. It's like, okay, what if technology evolves on its path and it results in something that we don't want? Frankenstein's the same train of thought. It's, yeah, we discover how to make life and we're horrified by it.
Don't play God.
Yeah.
How about that?
As a wise man once said, you play God, you're going to get what you ask for.
I never made it as a wise man.
Couldn't cut it as a poor man stealing.
Why are you guys doing Nickelback when I'm playing Kendrick Lamar?
Because it's
My
funny.
God. My God. Don't play me
traded
like that. I was being serious.
The greatest musician of the generation for the second greatest musicians of the generation.
That's fair.
Nickelback. Look at this graph.
I like the thing of that's apparently several of the band members' favorite Nickelback meme.
It's just the graph meme.
Yeah, they're like, when we saw that, we're like, this is funny as fuck.
We go make it out with this one.